Welcome to Books and Ideas, the podcast where we talk to guests from a wide range of fields, ranging from science to science fiction. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. You can find additional episodes of Books and Ideas at booksandIdeas.com and in your favorite podcasting app. You can send me feedback at docartemis@gmail.com. You can submit voice feedback via speakpipe.com/docartemis. And you can also post your comments and ideas on the Books and Ideas Facebook fan page. Today, I'm going to do a rare solo episode, and I'm going to share a modified version of a talk I gave last week at the first ever She Podcast Live event, which was held in Atlanta, Georgia from October 10th through 13th, 2019. I was asked to reflect on the ups and downs I have experienced in my nearly 13 years of podcasting. I don't really consider myself a pioneer, but I am a veteran, and I was eager to share what I've learned. I've adapted my content to make it meaningful to everyone, even for those of you who have no interest in ever starting your own podcast. So here we go. I want to start out by thanking Jessica Kupferman and Elsie Escobar for inviting me to speak at the first ever She Podcasts event. I really appreciated the opportunity to share my personal podcasting journey and hopefully to share some lessons that you will find helpful. Since I started podcasting in 2006, I will also share a few reflections about how podcasting has changed over the last 13 years. Most of the people in my audience did have a podcast, although many of them were beginners, and there were those who were just thinking about getting started. So we start out by talking about why we podcast. I think it's important to remember that podcasting had its roots in blogging, literally. Podcasting was born in 2004 when a couple of guys figured out how to create an RSS enclosure tag for audio files. This made it possible to share audio content the same way you would share a blog. So the simplest definition of a podcast is getting audio via an RSS feed, or putting it in simple English, an audio blog. Video came several years later. I don't know if any of you have blogged, but if you have, do you follow a strict schedule, or do you blog when you have something to say? But somehow people think podcasts have to be like on, a regular, predictable schedule. Well, professional bloggers are expected to generate multiple posts every day. After a while, quantity takes precedence over priority. Quality tends to suffer. So I encouraged my listeners at this event to think about their personal why. The question of quality versus quantity is a very important question to answer when deciding how often one is going to put out their podcast. Because you might not be able to put out good quality content as often as maybe somebody else. It kind of depends on what kind of content you're creating. So in the case of my shows, Brain Science and Books and Ideas, they rarely come out more than once a month because it takes a lot of time and effort to create science-type content. So looking back, as I said, podcasting appeared first in 2004, but the first important event was probably 2005 in the summer when Apple iTunes introduced podcasting. The early shows tended to be about tech, fiction, and fan casts. That is, shows about people's favorite TV shows and movies and whatnot. My first shows that I listened to were Skepticality and The Signal, two shows that came out of Atlanta, actually, and also This Week in Tech, better known as Twit. The first time I listened to some podcasts in July of 2005, my first thought was, I want in. But then I did my first recording in GarageBand, and I hated my voice. And I didn't come up with the idea for brain science until the summer of 2006. What was my original why? Well, I wanted to share my ideas with the world. But I didn't really like blogging. Another thing that was really important for me was that I was attracted to the sense of community that seemed to exist among the early podcasters. My inspirations were Leo Laporte and Mur Lafferty. In fact, Mur Lafferty had 2 shows, and that's one reason why I started out with 2 shows. For those of you who weren't listening to podcasts in the early days, the iPod was actually not the most popular device. There was a little MP3 player called the iRiver that the podcasting geeks all loved. But the thing was, you had to plug your MP3 player into your computer in order to sync it and put any content on it. There was no streaming back in those days. Even when the iPhone launched in 2007, you still had to plug it into your computer to sync the content. Also, Facebook wasn't really popular in 2005 to 2006-ish. MySpace was still a place to be. And Twitter didn't appear till 2007, just for some context. So how did people find their podcast? Well, before iTunes, they went to websites like the Podcast Pickle. I remember listening to early shows saying, please rate us on the Podcast Pickle. So I finally came up with the idea of brain science the summer of 2006, and then I spent 6 months trying to figure out how I was going to do my website and choosing WordPress and whatnot. I wouldn't recommend this now. If you're going to start a podcast now, you don't really even need a website. When I launched my shows in December of 2006, I was 51 years old. So I'd also say that there's no such thing as being too old to start podcasting. Why brain science? Well, I had been reading about neuroscience for about 3 years, and I felt that the coverage in the mainstream media was horrible. It was too superficial and often inaccurate. I wanted to share what I'd learned with people who didn't necessarily have the time to read about it on their own. My favorite part of being a physician is explaining difficult ideas to patients in plain English. So I knew that I was good at explaining stuff. Now, I didn't actually start out planning to interview people, but I discovered early on that I was good at it and that it was great fun to help scientists share their passion. This show, Books and Ideas, actually followed a very different path from brain science. I had this second show because, like I said, I was copying Mur Lafferty, and I was thinking that this was going to be the more personal show, right? When I look back, I cringe at episodes 3 and 4, which were ones devoted to what I thought were the best and worst books of 2006. I soon realized that I wasn't comfortable doing a show as personal as Mur's Geek Fu Action Grip. So Books and Ideas evolved into an interview show where I interview people from a wide variety of fields, ranging from science to science fiction, including history and a lot of other things. I've had lots of interviews with other podcasters, including Hall of Famers Elsie Escobar, Mur Lafferty, Dr. Pamela Gay, and most recently, Liz Covart of Ben Franklin's World. Now, Books and Ideas has not been that successful in terms of listener numbers. And my husband used to ask me why I continued producing it. I would describe Books and Ideas as a true passion project because I don't want to give it up despite its modest audience. But I'd really like to grow the audience because I think the content is great. The reason that I've spent time talking about this, Books and Ideas that is that it's going to be an important part of the story as we move later on into this talk. I'm going to take a minute to talk about the role of my family in my podcasting career. Unlike many of the women at this conference that I spoke at last week, I'm not a mother who's having to judge having babies or caring for children. My husband Dennis retired when I'd been podcasting for about a year, but his role was actually rather limited. At first, he would listen to every episode with the goal to give me constructive criticism, right? Finding mistakes mostly. But by the second year, he had quit listening because he admitted that he wasn't interested in neuroscience and he felt that I didn't really need his feedback anymore. I was a little disappointed that he didn't want to become involved in the technical aspects of podcasting. After all, he had a PhD in electrical engineering. I ended up mastering a lot of skills on my own, but those of you who are not technically inclined do not need to let that discourage you. These days, there's a lot of support out there now, so that I really believe anyone who wants to podcast can do it. So what about your family, if you're interested in podcasting? There are many couples out there that have been very successful working together, but you should also be prepared for apathy and even resentment. Because podcasting is really time-consuming, and you might even find it necessary to compromise. Perhaps you won't put out your show every week, which is the de facto norm, but don't let that stop you if you're interested in podcasting. No matter what the self-proclaimed experts say, there's no magical schedule that must be followed. I'm not going to give you a year-by-year account of my podcasting, but I do want to mention that 2008 was really a particularly rewarding year because I got to be a part of a fan cast called Buffy Between the Lines, and I got to be in several live podcasts at DragonCon, which is an event that occurs in Atlanta every year over Labor Day weekend. I also went to a big neuroscience meeting in Washington, D.C. in November of 2008. And while I was there, I had dinner with a listener who made a suggestion that really helped me avoid pod fading, which is when you just quit putting out your show because you run out of gas. He suggested that I go from every other week to monthly. At that point, I'd been putting out Brain Science every other week consistently without missing for 2 years. My initial response was, that's a horrible idea. But then I got to thinking about it and I realized the listeners were having a hard time keeping up the episodes anyway, and I decided to go to once a month, which was a lifesaver. The lesson here is that you want to find a schedule that works for you. And this is where my analogy to blogging comes back in. If you were blogging, you would be creating your content according to when you had content rather than some set schedule. Another thing is that for the first 10 years, I did my own audio editing. This was very time-consuming and tedious. Now there are so many tools that make podcasting much easier. But I consider the availability of affordable audio editing to be a lifesaver. I'll talk more about that later. The reason that I was able to resume Books and Ideas on a monthly schedule this January was directly related to finding a reliable editor, because now I can put out 3 or 4 shows a month because I've got this audio editing happening. I'm going to take a moment here to mention that I really need your help when it comes to helping to get Books and Ideas to more listeners. The best thing you can do is share it with your friends or on social media. And of course, rating and reviews are always appreciated. I'm still sending out Amazon gift cards to people who send me screenshots of their reviews. You can also support the show financially via Patreon.com. Patreon allows you to make a monthly pledge of whatever amount that works for you. This is the way you can help support the show by offsetting the costs. The biggest cost is audio editing. If you want to help out, just go to patreon.com/books and ideas. So after I went to once a month in early 2009, I went along producing the show every month, and that is Brain Science every month, and putting out books and ideas about every other month. In early 2010, I was getting frustrated about making so little income. Back then, PayPal was the main avenue for listener support. So I decided to try creating some premium content in the form of physical CDs. This was for Brain Science. And on the CDs, I separated the content into tracks to make listening easier. Of course, this was back when people were still using CDs. After about 3 months, I realized it just wasn't worth all the extra work I was doing. This was a critical decision point for me. I had to decide if I wanted to keep going, even though podcasting wasn't generating much income. I always say podcasting is either paying hobby or a really bad paying second job. Obviously, I decided to keep going, and this was largely because of listener feedback that made me aware of the impact that my show was having. Sometimes the people wrote things that were very surprising, but in retrospect, I really see this as a time when I really had to reevaluate the why. Why was I podcasting? I recommend that every podcaster reevaluate their why from time to time. It can change, and sometimes this means that what you podcast about changes. So I continued to podcast, and Lipson, who is my host, was constantly improving the tools that they provided for independent podcasters. I had the privilege of being one of the first shows to have mobile apps. Early on, these did generate a very modest income. Don't forget to check out the Books and Ideas mobile app if you haven't done so yet. It's currently free. In January 2014, I began to use something called My Lipson, which is a tool that makes it very easy to create premium content. And again, this is all regarding Brain Science. I had been making transcripts of both Brain Science and Books and Ideas since 2009, so I was able to convert the Brain Science transcripts into premium content. Also, at that point, I was around episode 80 of Brain Science, so I could make some of my back catalog premium. The listener response was really gratifying. People who had never wanted to do the PayPal thing were happy to support the show with the premium subscription. The timing of this was really critical because my life was about to get much more interesting. A few months later, and this is 2014, I decided that I was going to change my medical specialty. I'd been doing emergency medicine for over 20 years. In July of 2014, I started a fellowship in palliative medicine. What does a fellowship mean? Well, it actually means working twice as much and making half as much. So the fact that the podcast was finally generating a little bit of money was a major reason that I didn't put Brain Science on hiatus during my fellowship, though I didn't put out any episodes of Books and Ideas. There were some months where I used some of my favorite early episodes and re-aired them, so it came in handy that they were now behind the paywall. I should mention that the Group She podcast actually entered my life in 2014 when I met Jessica and Elsie at the first ever podcast movement, which was held in Dallas. So I finished my fellowship, my palliative medicine fellowship, at the end of June in 2015, and about 3 weeks later, my life was changed drastically when my husband Dennis died unexpectedly. This was less than a week before Podcast Movement 2015. We had been married for 38 years. By 2015, Facebook had become a major channel of communication. So naturally, I announced Dennis's death on Facebook, and I shared it in the She Podcast Facebook group. I'll never forget the support I got there. And when I attended Podcast Movement, Jessica Kupferman was there for me. And when I gave this talk live, I told Jess I'll never forget her support. As you might expect, I was in a state of shock for many months, but I kept podcasting because it was such a large part of my life. It helped me to feel normal. For example, I recorded a special episode of Books and Ideas dedicated to Dennis. That was very powerful, even though I don't usually share much of my personal life on my shows, partly because I'm usually trying to create evergreen content. It wasn't until the spring of 2016 that I finally hit the wall and had to take a 6-month break to figure out what I really wanted to do. I resumed brain science in September of 2016, but I didn't produce any episodes of Books and Ideas. A few months after Dennis died, I turned 60, and I was thinking about the rest of my life. And I realized I didn't want to spend it alone, but I really didn't want to spend it with another man. So I decided to come out as a lesbian. Of course, I also did this in the She Podcast Facebook group. In the fall of 2016, I began to think about starting a new podcast for people coming out LGBT+ later in life. But I have to admit that the election of Donald Trump made me afraid. However, by the summer of 2018, I had decided that I needed to step up and just do it. So Graying Rainbows was launched in November of 2018. It started out as a weekly show because Katie Kremitzos had encouraged me to record plenty of content before I launched. But I burned through that pretty quick, and it's now a monthly show, which seems to be the frequency that works for me. The lesson here is that if you're podcasting, please follow a schedule that you can maintain. Graying Rainbows is very different from my older shows because although it includes a few author interviews, it mostly features regular people sharing their stories. This has given me a new appreciation for the power of personal stories. My most recent episode features Shelley Johnson from the Latter-day Lesbians podcast, and you don't have to be gay to appreciate the power of Shelley's story. This is also the first time I've attempted to build a community, and I've learned that although I have a great yearning for community, building it is not in my wheelhouse. I'm so grateful that there's a member of the community who stepped up to manage our Facebook group, but I'm also painfully aware that my lack of participation is probably limiting its growth. I've also relearned the lesson from the early days of Books and Ideas. I'm really not that eager to share my personal story on my own podcast, even though I'm glad to do it on other people's shows. Over the last 6 months, I've been training to become a certified professional coach. My original idea was to coach people experiencing life transitions, including coming out. But along the way, I made some surprising discoveries. I rediscovered my passion for creating my original shows. This is where I will return to talking about Books and Ideas, because it plays a pivotal part in the story. Last fall, I decided to relaunch Books and Ideas, even though it had been on a prolonged hiatus of nearly 2 years. I was finally able to air an episode this January. In February, I recorded an interview with an evolutionary biologist who studies lizards. It was a great interview because my guest was so passionate about his work, and our conversation left me feeling energized and inspired. But it took several months for the experience to really sink in, because at that point, I thought I was going to build a business around graying rainbows. It's only been the last month or so that I came to realize that what I really want to do is to take brain science to the next level and find a way to grow the audience for Books and Ideas. I do plan to continue graying rainbows, but I'm going to let it grow in an organic way. So originally, this was billed in the program for the She Podcast Live event as the roller coaster ride of my journey in podcasting, or podcasting on life's roller coaster. And I'm not sure that it lives up to that billing, but I am going to reflect on the lessons that I have learned from this journey. Now, these lessons are specific to podcasting, but I think you might be able to apply them to some other creative area of your life if you're not interested in podcasting. The first one is be sure you know your why. Why do you want to podcast or follow whatever other dream it is that you want to pursue? For me, podcasting is a way to express my creativity. You might want to create or connect with a community or make money, but you need to just be honest with yourself and don't be surprised if your reason changes and evolves. If you're interested in podcasting, it's essential to find a great podcasting host. I've been using Lipson, Libsyn, since 2006, and they've been around since 2004. And what I like about Lipson is that they're constantly building new tools, figuring out ways to help us get on more locations. Like in the last year, we've gotten our shows on Pandora and Spotify and various places where we can find new listeners. Not to mention the tools for creating premium content that I mentioned earlier. There's also lots of great, number one, the support staff is fantastic, and that includes a lot of tutorials for helping beginners get started. Another great host is Blueberry because they've also been around since 2004. You want to have somebody who's in it for the long haul and who isn't just looking to make money off of you. I would also say you really want to beware of free podcasting hosts. In podcasting, it really is true that you get what you pay for. Almost every free host has issues, and good hosting is not that expensive. So I say beware of free, and also beware of companies that say that they're going to help you make lots of money. And whatever you do, don't let your host have the rights to your content. It should be yours. And you should be having the flexibility to leave at any time if you need to. The third lesson I want to share is get help. Don't go it alone. In the case of podcasting, consider outsourcing tasks like audio editing. Also, consider working with a co-host. That's one thing I wish I could have done. And become a part of the podcasting community. If your area of creativity is not podcasting, but it's something else, then find a way to be part of that community. Last but not least, be flexible and pay attention to how you feel. If you don't feel energized when you record an episode, explore why. The last thing I did in this talk in Atlanta was I asked my listeners if any of them considered themselves to be aspiring writers. Of course, quite a few people raised their hand. Before I discovered podcasting, writing was my preferred creative outlet. There's this old joke that people write not because they want to, but because they have to. That is to say that they have something that they want or need to share. Most writers never make the bestseller list, and most podcasters don't make a living from podcasting. But the beauty of podcasting is that you can reach people all over the world. So if you want something to share, podcasting really is a wonderful choice. As you might expect, my audience still wanted to know about making money. So I had prepared a few extra comments on this subject. I think that podcasting is a great tool for building a business, but unless you're already a celebrity or a media personality, a podcast is not likely to generate as much money as you might expect. Just like most books don't become bestsellers. That's why you need to be clear about your why. if we exclude the so-called procasters who have come over from radio and TV, there are basically two kinds of podcasters. Those that see it as a business and those that are using it as a creative outlet. Now, obviously, though, this isn't mutually exclusive, but you do need to be clear about your priorities. Because if you're approaching podcasting as a business, you may have to focus on quantity over quality. Whereas if creativity is your priority, you should be focusing on quality first. And listeners can tell the difference. And unless you have a team of minions, which I don't, you can't do both. Several years ago, I had a fan call me the Terry Gross of neuroscience. But if I was to try to create 5 shows a week all on my own, the quality of brain science would crash and burn. If you want to use your podcast to grow your business, great. But if you have something you need to share with the world, don't feel that you have to play by the so-called rules that your show must come out at least once a week and you must promote it on social media. It's okay to create great content and trust that it'll find its way to those who need it. I hope you have enjoyed this behind-the-scenes look at podcasting. The bottom line is that podcasting is very rewarding, but it's also very time-consuming. Your feedback is what keeps me going, so please send me your thoughts and comments. You can send me email at docartemis@gmail.com. You can submit voice feedback at speakpipe.com/docartemis. And you can post on the Books and Ideas Facebook fan page. I'll be back on the 15th of November with another interview, but until then, I hope you will check out my other shows, Brain Science and Graying Rainbows. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Books and Ideas is copyright 2019 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this show to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at docartemis@gmail.com. Theme music for Books and Ideas is The Open Door by Beatnik Turtle. Please visit their website at beatnikturtle.com.